The SEC is 16 strong. It's 16 today, 16 tomorrow. Well, what about the day after tomorrow? And the month after that, and the year after that? That's where Greg Sankey doesn't have an answer for the question. All he says is that the SEC is at 16 today and tomorrow. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. SEC Media Days are underway in Dallas. And maybe some of the most interesting happenings occurred during Sankey's address on Monday, where he received almost as many questions about future conference expansion as he did about Oklahoma and Texas officially being members of the league. Sankey at one point answered multiple questions in a row about whether the SEC would be interested in further expansion. And specifically, when he said the SEC is at 16 today and will be at 16 tomorrow, what did he mean by tomorrow? Well, he didn't have an answer for that. Sankey said, quote, "Our focus is on 16 members. I have a responsibility to pay attention, and I'm certainly not going to fuel speculation on what happens next." So John Sankey, as we know, is a master of dodging questions and giving you a little something without totally answering what was just asked. So what did you make of his remarks Monday as it pertains to SEC expansion in the future? And this is particularly relevant because Florida State and Clemson are suing the ACC, and Florida State in particular has made it very clear they want out of the ACC. And if you want out of the ACC, the two most logical avenues are to pursue entry to the SEC or the Big Ten. So what do we think of what Sankey's saying?
I would call it well-articulated vagueness. He always comes across well in his verbiage, but there's not a whole lot he can say. If we go back and look at other expansion, Texas and Oklahoma seemingly came out of nowhere. There wasn't much speculation leading up to that. And I assume the same thing could happen the next time, where it just sort of, you get blindsided by it. And what's interesting about that is we've waited so long for Texas and Oklahoma to actually come into the league after hearing this dramatic announcement. I mean, it was like, oh, Oklahoma and Texas, here they come. No, not yet, not tomorrow, not next year, but they'll be here. Just so it seems like they've already been here. So now people are asking questions about the next expansion. That announcement of Oklahoma and Texas came so long ago, it's way old news. So you have to speculate more. But this is the world in which we live. And when you start, you can't say we'll never expand because you know that's not true.
Well, and also, John, I mean, Greg Sankey, like I said, he almost seemed exasperated by the number of questions about further expansion. And I think to your point, like it's like he expected, there to be this big party for Oklahoma and Texas getting here. It's like, well, it took 3 years for Oklahoma and Texas to get here. Like that party's been occurring for the last 3 years. There was going to be no party in Dallas. The reporters were going to ask the relevant question in the room, and with two prominent football brands, Florida State and Clemson, suing the ACC. I mean, that question has to be asked. And, I think the reality here is, John, that if Greg Sankey could wave his magic wand and force Florida State and Clemson to stay in the ACC, that might be his ultimate preference. But he doesn't get to decide that. And so the question is, if Florida State gets out of the ACC, it's challenging this grant of rights deal. If it succeeds in getting out of the ACC and Clemson and others try to follow them out the door, what are you going to do then? Because I may understand the rationale that the SEC would like kind of everybody to stay in place where they're at. If everybody stays in place, that works great for the SEC because they have the strongest conference right now. But you don't get to control what Florida State does. You don't get to control how the judge rules in this lawsuit. So if Florida State is hell-bent on leaving, are you going to stand by and cross your fingers that the Big Ten won't add them, that the Big Ten won't add Clemson? Or are you going to get off the sideline and get into the mix for these two schools?
Well, it's as though the SEC has returned to its defensive roots. It's been pretty offensive minded lately, on the field and off. Texas and Oklahoma, that was a lot of offense. But now you're right. The Big Ten, if Clemson and Florida State join the Big Ten, that would do more for the Big Ten than it would for the SEC if Florida State and Clemson join the SEC, don't you think? I mean, that would put the Big Ten in the Florida market and in South Carolina. Tennessee's SEC's already in those markets. So I just think it means a lot to the Big Ten. And then if you makes the Big Ten even stronger, it's sort of an arms race. Going back to the Cold War days, where if one country developed a weapon, then you're thinking, well, we don't really need that, but I guess we better keep up. So there you go.
Yeah, I think of this may be a case where you have to play defense to prevent your top rival, which is the Big Ten, from playing some offense here. Now, what was interesting is, on the heels of Sankey's comments on Monday, the Action Network, Brett McMurphy used to work for ESPN, now works for the Action Network. He published a report on Tuesday with a bunch of anonymous sources placed in the Big Ten and the SEC that anonymously were saying neither conference would be very interested in Florida State. And I don't dispute that that's what people are saying, behind closed doors and behind the cloak of anonymity. But I'm sorry. I think if Florida State and Clemson, if they waltz out of the ACC, are these two conferences really going to stand by in a game of chicken and just say, like, well, we're not going to do anything because we don't think our rival conference here is going to do anything? No, I think the SEC time and time again has been a trendsetter, a pace setter. It has not been caught flat-footed when it comes to the expansion game. So I don't believe for a second that if the ACC starts to fracture and crumble and it becomes a fire sale on some of the top available brands in the South, headlined by Florida State, Clemson, throw North Carolina into the mix, I don't think the SEC would sit on the sidelines of that fire sale and let the Big Ten invade the South, scoop up those top brands, and become a 20-plus team conference that now penetrates your southern borders.
Sounds like carpetbaggers. It's as though there's snobbery toward Florida State and Clemson, particularly on the SEC's part. Is like, well, you're not really as good as we are. You're not up to our elite status. If you eliminated the SEC marquee for a minute and just looked at teams, just put them all together, I mean, Florida State and Clemson would look a lot better than a lot of teams in the SEC. It wouldn't even be close. So the snobbery is not warranted, certainly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, much like Texas and Oklahoma, I think Florida State and Clemson could step into this conference on day one and be a player. Does that mean they'd be celebrating in the confetti in Atlanta at the end of the season? Well, not necessarily. But, I mean, we're talking about Texas being one of the front runners to reach the SEC championship game this season. I don't know if we'd be talking about Florida State and Clemson in year one as being, hey, they could get to Atlanta. But as far as being top half teams, top half programs in the conference, yeah, I think you would make that case. They would fit right in. They'd fit the culture. They'd fit the football pedigree. The risk of turning up your nose at these two schools would be that the Big Ten actually does kind of have some interest in them. They're acting like they don't, but if they become available, they do have interest in them. And then suddenly they end up in the Big Ten. I mean, I think we can sit here today, John, and say that the SEC, after all this realignment, all this expansion, the SEC came out atop the heap. They went into this atop the heap, and they came out of this 3 years of musical chairs atop the heap. I mean, it's SEC 1 and it's Big Ten 2. When we talk about the conferences that can qualify 3 and 4, maybe even 5 teams for the college football playoff, we're really just talking about 2 conferences. When we're talking about conference wealth, the conversation starts with the Super 2. But I think we both believe that the SEC heads the pack and is still a little bit ahead, top to bottom, of the Big Ten. But I want you to envision a scenario in which Florida State and Clemson become available, and the SEC either sits on the sidelines or does not win the battle to get those two programs, and they wind up in the Big Ten. So now you have a 20-team Big Ten with Florida State and Clemson in it. Which conference do you think is stronger at that point? Do you still side with the SEC as being the strongest conference in the land? Or with Florida State and Clemson in tow, would a 20-team Big Ten be the strongest conference in college football?
I might still favor the SEC ever so slightly. It's won 13 of the last 18 national championships. So, but it would be very close. When I break down and I'll look at the top, I just made a list of 8 teams in the SEC. And I look at Georgia, Alabama, Texas, LSU, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Florida, Auburn. Well, I'll go one more and put Tennessee in there.
So that's kind of your top 9 programs.
If I take my top 9, and I think all those programs have plenty of resources. They might be down a little bit now. Auburn certainly is. Florida certainly is. We keep waiting for Texas A&M to opportunity knocks, and it just almost opens the door, but not quite. We just keep waiting on that. But we know it has everything in place to be good. I mean, if you would put a prototypical model of what you were looking for in a football program, I think Texas A&M would fit the prototype. And then when I look at the Big Ten, I go Ohio State, Michigan, Oregon, Penn State, Southern California, adding Clemson and Florida State and Washington. It just made the playoff, played for the national championship. I'm going to add a 9th team, Wisconsin.
Yeah, I was going to say Wisconsin. Yeah,
okay.
I think Wisconsin's a good one.
Okay, so that's 9 on 9. I still like the SEC a little more because of what's happened in the last 15 years or so. And it's you have to go back to 2003 and 4 when Southern California won back-to-back national titles. So it's not quite at the level as USC has been at times. But when you get beyond the way that the SEC really gets the edge to me is when we drop down below that.
Well, I want to pause you there, John, because I want to. You laid out nicely sort of what the top 9 I think would look like in each conference, and we can, squabble over maybe the number 9 team, but I think for the most part you drew a pretty clear line there of what the top 9 programs would be in each conference, and I do think the SEC still is maybe a little bit ahead of the Big Ten, but the gap is narrowing if Florida State and Clemson were to wind up in the Big Ten. If you take those two out of the mix and had to insert a couple more existing Big Ten programs into that top 9, you'd probably go with maybe Michigan State and Iowa, I guess. I mean, I know watching Iowa can be like watching paint dry, but like in terms of records, I think you'd probably add Michigan State and Iowa in place of Florida State and Clemson. And I think then the argument is pretty clear cut, right? Big Ten, still a nice conference, but if it's 9 on 9, the SEC is decidedly better. Its top 9 would be decidedly better overall than the Big Ten's top 9. That doesn't mean that Ohio State or Michigan can't win a national championship, but 1 through 9, the SEC would be better. But I do think the gap becomes a lot more narrow when you swap Iowa and Michigan State out of that top 9 and you shuffle in Clemson and Florida State. I mean, am I missing something here? I think it becomes a much, much closer conversation.
I agree. And one thing I wonder about, if Florida State and Clemson would go to the Big Ten, would that help their recruiting?
Could.
I mean, it's the SEC. Teams come into the SEC oftentimes, and it improves their recruiting. because it's a selling point when you're recruiting a player that he's going to play in the most prominent conference. You're going to be competing not just in practice against your own teammates, but on Saturday against better competition maybe than what you had in the Pac-12, may it rest in peace, Big 12 or ACC. I think, I don't know, Florida State recruits very well. Clemson recruits very well. Might help it just a little bit to be in a better conference. It could be a selling point. I don't know. But yeah, it's very, very close. And almost what it comes down to is, do you have the right coach?
Yeah, and I know where you were heading next, John, and let's go there now, is I think the conversation tilts more in favor of the SEC when you start to look at like the bottom 5 in the conference. That's where, even with Florida State and Clemson on board, I think if you look at like bottom 5 to bottom 5, the SEC would still be stronger. Now, I don't know how many people do that, right? Like when you're trying to win national championships, when you're trying to qualify playoff teams, do you puff out your chest and say, well, yeah, we didn't win the national championship this year. Our conference didn't produce the number 1 team, but hey, our number 16 team, our number 20 team is better than your conferences. That doesn't go very far in an argument. You're sitting around at the bar with your buddies and say, yeah, maybe Michigan won the national championship, but look what the number 14 team in the SEC did. So I don't know how far that argument goes, but I do think that's where the SEC's argument for still being the strongest conference in the land, with or without Florida State or Clemson, still holds some weight. So how do you look at like bottom 5 versus bottom 5? Who do you have in sort of the bottom mix of the SEC versus the Big Ten?
Well, Vanderbilt, that's one thing where the Big Ten would have an advantage. I don't think it has a program as bad as Vanderbilt. Clark,
but when you look at the collection, say the bottom 5 of the SEC, yeah, Vanderbilt, sure. The bottom of the Big Ten could argue that it's better than the very worst team in the SEC. But if you take like the bottom 5 from the SEC, that changes maybe year over year. But let's call it Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, South Carolina,
Arkansas.
Arkansas would be in that mix now, and Kentucky. Let's throw Kentucky in there. Kentucky with Mark Stoops has been punching above its historical weight. But if we're looking at things through a broader lens, we'll put Kentucky in that conversation. So your bottom 5, subject to change year over year in the SEC, you could say Kentucky, Arkansas, South Carolina, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt. And then you stack that up in the Big Ten, it would be Northwestern, it would be Rutgers, it would be Indiana, maybe Maryland and Illinois, could you say?
Yes.
I'm probably overlooking 1 or 2 at the bottom there, the Big Ten, but I think that would be sort of a comparable bottom 5 versus bottom 5. And I don't know that there's a ton of difference, but I do think it does lean toward SEC, and that's where the argument strengthens in favor of the SEC, even with Florida State and Clemson, if they were to wind up in the Big Ten.
Well, Northwestern has had its moments. It's certainly, done more, I guess, of late. But I look at that program, but then I look at the SEC where you have Kentucky has had 2 10-win seasons in the last, 7 or 8 years, or maybe 5 or 6 under Mark Stoops.
Mm-hmm.
Then you look at Mississippi State under Dan Mullen, and during one season, it wasn't another century. I mean, it was actually ranked number 1 in the country at one time.
The first year of the college football playoff system, Mississippi State was number 1. I mean, imagine, Rutgers or Northwestern being number 1 in the country. Again, it's sort of a weak argument to say like the bottom half of this conference is better than the bottom half of that conference. But I do think that's where the SEC sort of comes up aces is, yeah, it's got these national championship caliber programs at the top, but in a given year, Mississippi State or Kentucky can win 10 games. Now, does that change in a 16-team conference without divisions? Maybe that changes, but I still think the SEC would have top to bottom the strongest conference in the country. But when it comes to qualifying teams to a playoff, when it comes to contending for national championships, the Big Ten would close the gap with Clemson and Florida State on board. I mean, when you talk about the SEC having 13 of the last 18 national championships, Michigan won one during that stretch last year. Ohio State won one during that stretch. And then you add Florida State got one, and Clemson got two. So the Big Ten starts to look a whole lot better with those programs on board. And I know, Dabo Swinney has become a subject for mockery in the era of the transfer portal. Florida State got drubbed in their bowl game against Georgia. There were a lot of factors in play there. I mean, half of Florida State's team, it seemed like, opted out. But bottom line, Florida State and Clemson are going to open the season as top 15 programs, I think. Add them into the Big Ten, the gap is narrowed with the SEC. So it's going to be interesting, John. I do think both these conferences, particularly the SEC, would probably prefer that Florida State and Clemson go nowhere. Like I said, status quo works great for the SEC.
I agree. And two teams we haven't mentioned, though, that probably deserve recognition because they're playoff contenders are Missouri and Ole Miss. We think of them as being not in terms of long-standing prominence, but we look at them now and Ole Miss and it's top 5 in some preseason polls. Missouri last year finished 8th nationally, beat Ohio State, held it without a touchdown in a bowl game. I know some of the guys opted out, but still, those are two programs. See, we named 9 programs that we think in the SEC that are sort of at a topper level. Mm-hmm. But you add those two, and so you could say, based on that, 11 of your 16 programs can reasonably have a run at the playoffs. That's pretty strong.
I think where we're headed, John, is 20-team conferences. Again, I don't buy this argument that if Florida State became available, neither the Big Ten nor the SEC would open its door. Don't believe that. Don't believe there wouldn't be some interest as well in North Carolina and Virginia, two programs we've talked about previously. I know Virginia doesn't seem to move the needle a ton in football, but if you look at past SEC expansions, they love to get into neighboring states. I think the SEC would really like North Carolina. And if you add one, you need to add two, functioning with an odd number. The Big Ten did it, but it's not ideal. And so if you look at the history, I think those programs would be in the conversation. I think we're heading for 20-team super conferences. We've already got super conferences. Nobody's hit 20 yet. I think that could be the future. I don't know when that is. Greg Sankey has said it's not tomorrow. 16 is the number tomorrow, but he won't say what the number is, understandably so, because he can't predict entirely what's going to happen in the SEC, or excuse me, in the ACC. But if you were to predict, John, let's say I'm going to give you some runway here. 5 years from now, you got 5 years to make this happen. Where are Florida State, Clemson, and North Carolina? We'll just leave it at those three. Where are those programs competing 5 years from now? Doesn't have to all be the same place. If you think some are going Big Ten, some would wind up SEC, that's fine. But or maybe you think they stay in the ACC. The year is 2029. Where are those three schools? What conference are those three competing in?
See, the problem here is this is a court case, and it's so hard. It's so hard to project how a court case will go. Can they litigate their way out of the ACC? But in 5 years, I would think these schools would be somewhere else. So I will. I'll put North Carolina and Virginia in the SEC.
Mm-hmm.
Florida State and Clemson in the Big 12.
The Big 12. You don't think they go Big 10? You think the Big 12 snaps them up, huh? That's a wild card. We hadn't even mentioned the Big 12. I like that.
Well, I was just trying to throw deep and maybe maybe get you sleeping a little bit and get my.
Well, I mean, maybe there's something. Maybe if there is legs to this report, that the Big Ten and the SEC aren't interested in Florida State and Clemson, and Florida State's hell bent on getting out of the ACC. Well, there's really only one other spot you can go, and that's the Big 12. And P.T. Barnum, Brett Yormark over there in the Big 12. You telling me he wouldn't jump at these two brands? I think he absolutely would. If you're playing games down in Mexico, I think you're willing to play games in Tallahassee, Florida, and Clemson, South Carolina, two places where college football rules. So, yeah, that is a sneaky wild card. We really hadn't discussed, but I'm glad you went there because Big 12, Big 12's a player, I think, here. If you're going to extend past the Super 2 to the Power 3, Big 12 enters that conversation. So if you get turned down by the top two, that would leave the Big 12 if the Seminoles really are determined to get out of the ACC.
Well, here's another thing with Florida State and Clemson. If they look at it from a standpoint of, I wonder how they feel. I mean, these programs have had enough success. Don't you think it's kind of a problem for their ego to the idea? And we don't know. We really don't know for sure. But you want to feel these programs feel as though they have a lot to offer. Why wouldn't they?
Mm-hmm.
So if the Big 12 puts on a full court press and say, man, we wanted you from the get-go, you become our top two programs.
And here's a bag of cash.
And here's another thing. Wouldn't you have a better path to the college football playoff if you were in the Big 12 than if you're in the ACC now?
I'm not sure. I think that's probably splitting hairs. I see them both as one big leagues in truth. But I don't see the SEC as a one bid league. And let's pivot there, John, in terms of expectations for the top end of the conference, because Nick Saban became, would you imagine that, the star of SEC Media Days this week. Guy's retired, but he's dominating the SEC network set, and it's like everything he says becomes headline news. A couple interesting things Saban said this week from Dallas. Curious your thoughts on these. He was asked to predict the SEC championship game, and he earmarked Georgia and Texas. Now, I could say Saban is copycatting me. That's who I've been predicting for a while. You know that. But I'm not sure that's true. I don't know how much stock Saban puts in my opinions, but that's where he's going as well. Georgia and Texas is who he's got for the SEC championship game. He also said, though, John, this was interesting. He also said he sees Ole Miss as an 11-win team. So if he's got Georgia and Texas earmarked for Atlanta and Ole Miss as an 11-win team, that must mean he thinks Georgia is either going to go 11-1 or 12-0. Texas will either be 11-1 or 12-0. And don't forget, those two schools play each other in Austin, so they can't both be 12-0. Either Georgia or Texas will have a minimum of one loss. And he's got Ole Miss at 11-1. What do you think of that? I mean, I know we like all three of those schools. We've said before, we would have those three in the top three of our SEC standings. You've got Ole Miss 2, Texas 3. I've got Texas 2. Ole Miss, actually, I think I have Ole Miss 4, but I digress. We both really like those three very highly. So does Saban. So what do you think about that? He's got Georgia, Texas, and Atlanta. Ole Miss at 11-1. Where is Alabama in this? Is he just spewing rat poison out there, or do you think he's down on the tide?
Well, I don't think he did the math there. I mean, if Ole Miss goes in 11-1, I think it's playing for the SEC championship. I think it's going to be Georgia and Ole Miss playing a rematch. They play in Oxford this year, so that's what I would have. If you, I don't see. Yeah, I just don't see it that way, and I don't know how much he thought about it. I wonder if he did that intentionally, to not wanting to put pressure on Alabama, his former school, or you could look at it like just the opposite. Well, I'd have him in the top 2 if I were still coaching. He just
Right.
won the basically what he's saying, he just won the SEC championship. And now he's gone, no, they won't play for the championship.
The
So
Saban quote that was getting a ton of attention from Dallas was when he said, in regards to Texas, he said, quote, "They're not going to run the SEC." And that quote was taken, as we often see happen, and pasted onto social media. The video was played. I think what that lost, though, was the context. It makes a great headline, Saban saying about Texas, they're not going to run the SEC. But I think the context of that, what it seemed like he was talking about was like, they're not going to run the SEC's boardroom. The Texas, when it was in the Big 12, it wielded the biggest stick at the Big 12's decision-making table. I mean, what Texas wanted, it usually got inside the Big 12. Saban's full quote, which conveniently got left out of some clickbait headlines, was, quote, "They're not going to run the SEC. There's a whole lot of arrogant people in a lot of places in the SEC, so they can forget about all that. They'll be a good team and a great program, and Sark will do a great job." And he later said, in regards to Texas's football team, he said, quote, "I really like Texas." So again, I think the context of that line about they're not going to run the SEC was lost. I really think Saban was talking about, like, they're not going to run the boardroom. They're not going to control all the decisions in the conference, as at least the perception, and I think to some degree the reality was in the Big 12. But when you add in the context and when you listen to what else Saban was saying about Texas, I think it's clear he thinks Texas has one of the best teams in college football this year. And I think he is a believer in what Steve Sarkisian is building in Austin, probably unsurprisingly, since Sarkisian was formerly Saban's offensive play caller. And I think he holds him in about the highest regard, really. I mean, I think if Saban could have picked his heir at Tuscaloosa with no complicating factors, whoever he wanted to pick would say yes to the job, I think Sarkisian would have been near the top of Nick Saban's list. I think Sarkisian was at or near the top of Alabama's list. Sark's got a good thing going in Texas. He got a pay raise and stayed right where he was at. And then Alabama quickly snapped up Kalen DeBoer. But I don't know. I think it sure sounds like Saban is a believer in Texas. How much of a challenge do you think it's going to be for Texas to transition in this conference? And what do you think about the idea that Texas won't swing the biggest stick in the boardroom in the SEC like it did in the Big 12? Because I'm not so sure about that. I still think Texas is going to swing a pretty big stick at the decision-making table.
Yeah, I think it'll have a lot of input. And some people, a lot of long-term SEC fans would say, no, I know what Saban's saying. He's saying Alabama's still going to run this conference because that's how a lot of SEC fans outside Alabama look at this conference, at what Alabama wants, it gets. What Nick Saban wants, he gets. So they may read something else into it entirely. Yeah, I mean, Texas didn't have the best football program in the Big 12. Oklahoma had a better football program, and that's what we're mainly about here. But Texas has a great all-around sports program, and it's so big. I mean, Texas, this state is so big with so many populated areas. So sure, it's going to have a lot of input. So I don't know that anybody. I don't think it will run the conference, but I think it'll have a strong vote in what happens. Why wouldn't it? You're bringing Texas and Oklahoma into this league for a reason. Let's don't completely forget about Oklahoma. I mean, it's a storied football program. So I don't know. The most interesting thing to me about this was because Nick Saban said it, it becomes the news story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at the end of the day, he's a former football coach. I mean, yeah, maybe the best ever, but what he's saying, and he's still got an office there at Alabama, I I think some people are going to be thinking, "Oh, is he still calling the shots in the SEC?" Yeah, but you have to admit he generated headlines.
Yeah, he stole the show this week in Dallas. I mean, Saban became the biggest newsmaker, and he's not even the coach anymore. And I think that will be the case for a while. Now, I think part of that depends on how Kalen DeBoer does. If Kalen DeBoer starts red hot, Alabama's in the college football playoff, especially if Alabama beats Georgia when Georgia comes to Tuscaloosa, I think there's going to be a lot less talk about Nick Saban, be a lot less headlines featuring Nick Saban. Not a total lack of it. Saban, is always going to have a bit of a megaphone. But if DeBoer and Alabama start red hot, I think that turns down the attention on Saban a little bit. If he starts poorly, I think that dials up not only the heat, but everything Nick Saban says, becomes magnified that much more. But what's interesting about this, John, and like I said, maybe this is intentional. Maybe Saban is trying to do DeBoer and Alabama a solid and sort of, make them seem like a dark horse, if anything, this year. But it just seems like there's as little talk about Alabama as there's been in some time. I mean, with Georgia being the likely front runner in the conference, with Texas coming in off a college football playoff semifinal, and all the hoopla around Texas coming into the league, and then all the hoopla around Lane Kiffin and his latest haul from the transfer portal. I mean, everybody's buzzing about the Rebels as a playoff team, as a team that can maybe get to Atlanta. There just seems to be a really lack of a spotlight on Alabama right now. And I think the more this goes, the more I look at the staff and the roster that DeBoer has, the way he's handled his first 6 months on the job. Maybe I'm just sipping the Kool-Aid, but I don't have them penciled in as national champs. But the more and more time goes, I think Alabama's a playoff team, and I think it's going to be a pretty splashy debut for DeBoer. And I actually think the stage is set about as well as it could be for anyone coming in after Nick Saban. That was always going to be a tough challenge, but this is about as good of a scenario as you could have it, with all the attention seemingly being on Georgia, Texas, and to a degree Ole Miss as well.
Yeah, what's interesting is if you go back and you don't have an expansion and you don't have divisional play, I think Ole Miss would be favored to win the West.
Ooh.
If you went back, I mean, I would favor if you go back to the old model.
Yeah, you take Texas out of the mix.
Mm-hmm. Have Texas out of the mix, and you got Ole Miss, LSU, Alabama. I'd pick Ole Miss in that group. Now, maybe some people wouldn't have maybe they would view Alabama better if it were still back in the divisional setup, because you're right. I mean, the idea of Texas coming in, but I really think when I look at the two depth charts, I think Ole Miss has a better team than Alabama, and they both have good coaches. But I like Ole Miss a little better right now.
I've liked Ole Miss the whole way through. I feel like Alabama and LSU, to a lesser degree, are two teams that if you would have asked me at the end of January, are they playoff teams? I don't know if I would have had them on the right side of the cut. I definitely don't think I would have had Alabama on the right side of the cut. Saban just retired. A few really nice players transferred, including Caleb Downs going to Ohio State. It didn't seem like the sky was falling entirely in Tuscaloosa, but the sky was leaking a little bit. There were a few pieces at least falling down there in Tuscaloosa. But that was in January. And I think Alabama and LSU, I'm starting to like both of them a little bit better now. With LSU, I just keep thinking their defense can't be as bad as it was last year. I think that offense is going to be really good still. Maybe not as good, but still really good. I believe in Garrett Nussmeier. I like the fact that 3 of their toughest conference games are at home, being Ole Miss, Alabama, and Oklahoma. So those are 3 programs that I feel like, at least in my mind, their stock has risen in the last 6 months. And it's not necessarily because of anything they did. It's just the way perception has changed in my mind over the last 6 months. And Missouri would be one I would have probably had in my playoff field if you would have asked me at the end of January. And now I lean no on Missouri in the playoffs. I have Missouri at about 9-3. And I just think with Missouri, I still think they're a good team, but I think back to a couple games last year that could have gone the other way. Thinking about that Kansas State game, thinking about the Florida game. Florida sort of snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory, as they say, and that one. And you take out Cody Schrader, the SEC's leading rusher, from the mix. I think that is a departure that's sort of being overlooked, by Missouri. So that's a team maybe where I've decreased the stock just a little bit. And I'm wondering if there's a program or two where you feel like your perception has improved of them in the last 6 months, and then maybe is there one where you've cooled on a little bit throughout the past 6 months?
Yeah, that's really tricky because we have so much time between the last game of one season and the first game of the next season. And because we're so involved with SEC football, with podcasts, with writing about it, we have an opportunity to think, rethink, and then rethink again. And I see what you're saying about those teams. I think Alabama might be a little better than I thought. Oklahoma might be a little better than I thought. But I look at two teams sort of that nobody talks about in a playoff conversation, certainly. Are Florida and Kentucky are two teams I look at from the middle to the bottom of the league. And I think they're better than what I envisioned at the end of last season. What I thought they would be in January, now I think of them as better teams. Now, I think Florida's schedule is so stacked with formidable opponents. I don't see how Coach Billy Napier survives. I don't think he will. However, if you're playing Florida in September, first 2 weeks of October, I believe you'll have a tougher opponent than what I thought you would have last January. The more I look at that depth chart, I just like Florida better than I did. They got the quarterback returning. They've got a really good receiver, Eugene Wilson, that sparkled as a freshman, and I think their depth will be better overall. So that's in Kentucky. Kentucky returns 9 defensive starters, and they added Jamon Dumas-Johnson from Georgia, who was a all-SEC player. Kentucky's a team I didn't even think about in January, and I don't think about it as being a playoff hopeful team, but I think of it as being capable of beating a team that's playoff hopeful. And what's really interesting to me, and one reason I'm really looking forward to the season, is this 12-team playoff. To me, I look at it, there's so many possibilities for the SEC to make that playoff. There really is. I see this as sort of a rush to 10-2. If you can go 10-2 overall in the SEC, to me, you got a strong case to make the playoff. And I look at all these teams I think could do that.
Is there anybody you're cooling on, John? Maybe that you don't think is going to be a total bust, but that you were hotter on in January or February or March than maybe you are, 6 weeks out from the start of the season here?
Not a lot, but I do kind of wonder about Georgia.
Oh, wow. Cooling on Georgia.
Well, I would still pick it as the best team, but I wonder, when I look at championship teams, I see great players who make game-deciding plays in these playoff games. We can go back and go through almost any season, and we see that. We've certainly seen it with Georgia. Stetson Bennett came to mind, the former Georgia quarterback. Brock Bowers is another guy, the hybrid tight end, that came to mind. We could even look at defensive players. I'm not sure Georgia has those kind of guys. Maybe it does, but that's the only thing. Admittedly, I have to be really picky about Georgia when I say I've cooled a little bit on Georgia. I still, when I look at it, I think of it as the best team. And if we went back to last year and you put Georgia in the playoff, I would have picked Georgia to win the whole thing. So I probably misspoke saying I've cooled on Georgia. Maybe I should say I don't know. I don't see anybody that I've really cooled on, but I do agree with you on Missouri. Everything kind of broke Missouri's way. And I also thought Cody Schrader was one of the SEC's more valuable players in recent years. And I'm not sure he got full appreciation. He made all SEC. Didn't he lead the SEC in rushing yards per game?
He did.
But when you just watch that guy play, I mean, he was just a driving force, I thought, with that team. And he made so many, he could block. We know he could break tackles. And he ran fast enough. They talked about a lack of speed, but he outran some secondary guys. I saw him do that a few times, and he could catch the ball well coming out of the backfield. So that was a huge loss for Missouri. I don't think they replaced him. So you think of Missouri as a playoff contender, and if it had Cody Schrader, I'd say, yeah, I'd bet on it making the playoff, but I don't know about now.
All right, well, talking season will give way to the playing season here in about a month and a half. John and I will stick with you in the meantime, though. We'll be back with you next week, and thanks for stopping by on today's installment of SEC Football Unfiltered.